In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 7, where in our last video, we developed the long-run aggregate supply curve in the ADAS model. In this video, we will develop the short-run aggregate supply curve by considering the curve itself in order to discuss its slope as well as determinants, from which we will consider shifts in both the long-run and short-run aggregate supply curves. Then we will conclude with a summary on the short-run aggregate supply curve. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, currently we are developing the ADAS and Phillips curve models in order to convey our story of business cycles, where thus far we are underway in our development of the ADAS model, which we mentioned was a representation of the aggregate product market of an economy, and in terms of its components, we have developed the long-run aggregate supply curve, which represents potential real GDP in an economy. Now we'd like to move on to our second component, which will be the short-run aggregate supply curve. With this in mind, well, the short-run aggregate supply curve represents the real GDP level firms in the economy are willing and able to supply at alternative price levels in a given time period, holding all else equal. Where, focusing on this curve in our model, we have the price level on the vertical axis and the quantity level of real GDP on the horizontal axis. We see with respect to the short-run aggregate supply curve that it's this upward sloping curve here in red. Now, in terms of why the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, or that there's a positive relationship between the price level and the quantity level of real GDP supplied, is going to be attributed to the profit effect as well as the cost effect, where starting with the profit effect and beginning with our graphic on the left, in which we are considering the point A at the price level P0 and at the quantity level of real GDP Y0. Well, in the short run, some costs that firms face will be fixed in that they may be in contracts with their employees on the wages that they are paying them, as well as they may be in contracts with their suppliers on the materials they use for what they produce goods and services with. Such that with these fixed costs, if there were to be an increase on the price of their goods and services, this would translate to increased profitability. Well, recall that firms are agents with the resources of factors of production that they use to fulfill their wants of profits with, where with increased profitability, this then increases their incentive to supply more in terms of real GDP. So then what occurs is, moving on to our graphic on the right, where if we're at the price level P0 at the quantity level Y0, if the price level were to increase from P0 to P1, given that there's fixed costs that these firms are facing due to being in contracts, this means increased profitability, where with increased profitability, this then means that they would want to increase quantity supplied in terms of real GDP, going from Y0 to Y1, which lands us on point B, where at point B, we see due to the price level increasing, quantity level responded by increasing as well, generating a positive relationship between the price level and quantity level in terms of real GDP supplied as required. Now, moving on to the cost effect, well, if some firms in the economy are not facing fixed costs on their inputs, then starting on our graphic on the left once more, at point A at a price level P0 and a quantity level of Y0 in terms of real GDP, well, if firms wanted to increase the quantity level of real GDP supplied going from Y0 to Y1, given that some of their inputs are not fixed, in order to produce more goods and services, this translates into incurring more costs due to using more factors of production. Well, since firms want to fulfill their wants of profits, if nothing else changes, this would decrease their profitability. So what they would want to do is offset this by generating more money, which they can do by increasing the price on their goods and services, such that additional revenue flowing in will now match the additional money flowing out from those additional costs from production. So then, to go from Y0 to Y1, firms would respond by offsetting this by raising the price on their goods and services, translating into the price level of the economy going from P0 to P1, which lands us once again on point B, in which there's a positive relationship between the price level and the quantity level of real GDP supplied as required. Now moving on to determinants, since the short-run aggregate supply curve represents the willingness and ability for firms to produce and sell in terms of real GDP, this means the short-run aggregate supply curve will be determined by factors that alter the ability for firms in the economy to operate, where such factors will include input costs, taxes, subsidies, market power, inflationary expectation, the availability of factors of production, as well as productivity. Where, in terms of input costs, these are going to be things such as wages paid to employees, where if wages increase, holding the price level constant, it becomes more expensive for firms to operate, such that they have incentive to decrease what they are supplying. In terms of taxes, this is what they pay to the government. If taxes increase, then holding the price level constant, it is now more expensive for firms in the economy to operate, such that they have incentive to decrease what they are supplying. Moving on to subsidies, this is going to be the opposite of taxes, in that the government will be helping firms out. Should subsidies increase, then holding the price level constant, firms will now find it cheaper to operate, such that they have incentive to increase what they are supplying. Now considering market power is the ability for firms to alter the price on their goods and services. Should firms in the economy have more market power, holding the price level constant, this gives them incentive to increase the goods and services that they are supplying. And moving on to inflationary expectations, what firms perceive inflation to be in the future will alter their decisions in the current period. In that, if in the current period firms expect inflation to increase in the future, well, with an increase in inflation, this also means an increase in the price level had to have occurred. Well, with an increase in the price level, this then means greater profitability. Since firms have a want for profits, they would want to pursue this. So what they would do in the current period is holding the price level fixed, is restrict their supply in the current period so they can take advantage of the greater prices in the future period due to that increase in inflation. Now, in terms of factors of production, should firms have more factors available to them, such as labor, then holding the price level fixed, they'd be able to produce more goods and services, which would increase their incentive in terms of what they're supplying. And lastly, in terms of productivity, holding the price level fixed, if existing factors were able to produce more, then this would increase firm incentive to increase what they were supplying as well. So then, with these determinants in mind, and the direction that they move in terms of if a determinant changes, what does that mean in terms of firm incentive of supplying? Let us give a graphical representation of this, where we will use the inflationary expectations determinant, in which we'll consider first an example in which inflationary expectations decrease, then we'll consider the example of inflationary expectations increasing. So in this example, we have our short-run aggregate supply curve, price level on the vertical axis, quantity of real GDP on the horizontal axis. Assuming that we're on a short-run aggregate supply curve at point A at the quantity level of Y naught in terms of real GDP and at the price level P naught. If in the future firms expect inflation to decrease, this translates to, well, to have a reduction in inflation, this means a reduction in the price level. Well, with a reduction in the price level, this means decreased profitability, which means a reduced amount of profits. So in order to take advantage of the greater price point that firms are facing in the current period, what they'd want to do is increase the supply of what they are doing in terms of production and selling with respect to real GDP, which translates into a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve from short-run aggregate supply in red to short-run aggregate supply 1 in purple, where at all price levels, firms in the economy are now willing and able to supply more in terms of real GDP, where at our initial point, holding the price level constant fixed at P naught, this means rightward movement from point A to point B on our new short-run aggregate supply curve, in which firms would be willing and able to supply a Y naught or Y1 amount of real GDP, which we see as an increase from Y naught. Now proceeding on to the opposite case, if firms perceive inflation to increase in the future, well, if they expect inflation to increase in the future, that means they expect the price level to increase as well, where with higher prices, this translates to greater profitability. Since firms have a want of profits, they'd want to take advantage of that by restricting their supply today. So what this means in terms of our short-run aggregate supply curve is that we'll see a leftward shift, in that if we start our initial graphic at the short-run aggregate supply curve in red at point A with a price level P naught and at a quantity level of Y naught in terms of real GDP, with increased expectations on inflation and wanting to take advantage of that when it occurs, they will restrict their supply, in which we'll see a leftward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve from short-run aggregate supply in red to short-run aggregate supply 1 in purple, where at all price levels, firms would be willing and able to supply left, where at our original price level P naught and holding it fixed, this translates to leftward movement from point A to point B on our new curve, where firms are now willing and able to supply a Y1 amount of real GDP, which we see is a strict decrease compared to Y0. So then, now having gone through our determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve and an example of a rightward and a leftward shift of the curve, we also want to observe in our discussion of determinants that there is overlap between the short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve in terms of the determinants. More specifically, the short-run aggregate supply curve was determined by the availability of the factors of production, which has an overlap with the labor force of an economy, given that labor is used to produce goods and services with and is a factor of production. And more explicitly, we saw that productivity was a determinant of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So then what this means is that if there is a permanent increase in the labor force of an economy or a permanent increase in productivity, we have seen that this translates to an increase in potential real GDP or a rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, we also know then in our previous discussion in our prior slides that this would translate into a rightward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve as well, going from short-run aggregate supply to short-run aggregate supply 1 as well. Additionally, if we had the off chance of a permanent decrease in the labor force of an economy or a permanent decrease in productivity of the economy, we have seen that this would translate into a decrease in potential real GDP, which would correspond to a leftward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And in our discussion in the prior slides, we know then that this would also translate into a leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply, going from short-run aggregate supply to short-run aggregate supply 1. So then, with all this in mind, giving a summary of the short-run aggregate supply curve, it represents the willingness and ability of firms to produce and sell in terms of real GDP, in which there's a positive relationship between the price level and real GDP supplied as determined by the profit and cost effects. And in terms of its determinants, it will be determined by factors that alter the ability for firms to operate, in which if one of these factors change, we'll see a leftward or rightward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, where there were some overlap between the determinants of the short and long-run aggregate supply curves, such that if the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, then there will also be a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. With all this in mind, we'll pick up in our next video by developing the aggregate demand curve.